I'm going to be speaking tonight about manuscripts that I studied as part of my doctoral research. And I very much appreciate the chance to present this material for you. Especially, I'm grateful to have been compelled to pull it all out again and reassess it, and hopefully, in the thinking behind this talk and in this talk and our conversation, maybe bring it a few steps forward. So I thank you in advance for your comments and friendly questions. In a new book by Richard Eaton and Philip Wagner entitled Power, Memory, Architecture, Contested Sites on India's Deccan Plateau 1300 to 1600, these scholars describe how, beginning in North India around the 11th century, and then in the southern part of India, known as the Deccan, in about the 14th century, two great literary and cultural traditions came into contact with one another. The Sanskrit Cosmopolis, to use Sheldon Pollock's phrase, which had shaped societies in South and Southeast Asia since the 4th century, and the Persian Cosmopolis, which reached from West to South Asia and from about the 9th to 19th centuries. As they came into contact, these two traditions profoundly affected one another, bringing about new forms of culture. While Eaton and Wagner choose to focus on examples drawn from architecture, urban planning, inscriptions, and even military technology, insights into this process of mutual interpenetration have also arisen from studies of Mughal painting and of Safavid artists who left Tabriz or Shiraz to serve at the Mughal court. In one seminal study, Pramod Chandra in 1976 began his book on the Sinbad Nama, one of the earliest known Mughal manuscripts, with a look at 7 Persian artists who, he argued, began in India to gradually incorporate elements from local visual culture and to develop what he called a bolder, more expressive style. In 1987, Priscilla Souchek looked at how these artists disseminated Persian forms in India through their work and teaching, and how each one responded differently to the new visual landscape as a result of their training, motivations, and so on. The 1992 volume focusing on this large painting known as Humayun's Garden Party explored the role of artists from Tamask's atelier in the creation of this monumental early work of Mughal pictorial arts, and in particular an article by Ashok Das asserted that the assimilation of elements from Persian painting into what became the Mughal style was prompted by the patrons Humayun, Akbar, and Jahangir themselves in their desire to create and prompt artists to produce a new style that would be beautiful and novel at the same time. And then in 1999, we have Abdullah Sudavar's study that looked at political and economic conditions that led Persian artists to depart for India, and suggested that some artists were more ready than others to embrace the new tastes they encountered there. Scholarship of this kind emphasizes how key individuals served as conduits by which Persian painting was transmitted to a new region and adapted for a new context. At the same time, over the last 2 decades, we've come to see how practices within the Mughal imperial workshop guided these artists towards a homogeneous style that we now call imperial Mughal painting. This work, cumulatively, has provided us with a nuanced model for understanding these processes of transmission and codification. I would argue that it has also tended to dominate inquiries into the work of early modern manuscript production within this corner of the vast Persian cosmopolis, such that one can easily forget how exceptional the Mughals were, not only in terms of their might and their power, but also in the vast information we have about their history and society, and the breakneck speed with which their artists began to work together to produce an imperial style. In my work, I have explored the transmission of Persian painting, its reception and local transformation in another South Asian courtly context, that of the Deccan, the upland plateau that occupies most of South India. That's sort of the pinkish area on this map, which was home to a number of Islamic polities starting around 1300, when the region was incorporated into the Delhi Sultanate. While Persian emigres were a constant and influential presence in the Deputy Sultanate of Golconda, on which I focus, there's little definitive evidence of the presence of Persian painters, nor is there evidence of a royal workshop until around 1600. And as much as scholars like me might wish it were so, there is no single courtly style associated with Golconda. As a result, we cannot as yet consider the production of a local form of Persianate painting through the lens of individual artistic training, production, and teaching, or as the product of a sophisticated workshop system. But Persian manuscripts were being produced there since at least the 1570s, and the evidence of these objects offers, I think, unique insights into these issues. I aim to examine the earliest known Persian and later Urdu illustrated manuscripts made in Golconda, or rather that survive from Golconda, focusing on 3 manuscripts dating from about 1570 to 1610. But first I'll provide a little more information about Golconda itself. Sultan Quli, the founder of the dynasty of Qutb Shahi sultans, who ruled Golconda from 1518 to 1687, was born in northwest Iran around 1470. He was the descendant of Jahan Shah, ruler of the Karakoyunlu, and it was this princely ancestry that forced him to leave Iran when the Akkoyunlu became dominant. Like many others in this period, he made his way to India and found success there as a military general at the court of the Bahmani Sultanate. When Bahmani control of the Deccan collapsed around 1500, Sultan Quli was able to set himself up as an independent ruler, governing the erstwhile Sultanate's easternmost territory, which is in modern-day Andhra Pradesh. Sultan Quli ruled Golconda very much as Deccani rulers had for centuries. He relied on administrative structures that had been set up by pre-Islamic states in the region, and he adopted long-established local ideas of kingship and authority. By and large, his successors followed suit. At the same time, Sultan Quli strengthened Golconda's ties to Safavid Iran and used emigre courtiers as close advisors. It was no coincidence that immediately after the establishment of the Safavid dynasty, Sultan Quli ordered the Shia khutbah to be read in Golconda, a significant change after centuries of rule by the Sunni Bahmanis. This was only one of many ways that Golconda articulated its belonging within the larger Persianate world. I think I was hoping that you would be gazing on these beautiful monuments that whole time. So you'll just have to take them in quickly now. While immigrant artists surely came to Golconda, just as they did to the Mughal court, there's much more evidence for individuals whose backgrounds lay in diplomacy, in trade, and in letters. One exceptional case is a manuscript of a medical text, the colophon of which identifies it as the work of one Fakir Baba Mirak of Herat in Golconda in 1572. Though he was an illuminator of immense skill, we have as yet no evidence that he supervised an atelier or produced other manuscripts in the Deccan. This is a single, solitary work. What we do have in great numbers, though, are Persian manuscripts produced in Iran or Central Asia, containing imprints of the seals of Qutb Shahi rulers. Just to give 2 examples, Qutb Shahi seals are found on the Hermitage Khamsa of 1431, made for Shah Rukh, and Sadiqi Beg's 1593 Anwari Suhaili, now in the Aga Khan collection. After close examination of the earliest surviving manuscripts that were made in Golconda, I have come to feel that it was most likely local Deccani artists who had access to manuscripts like these, or perhaps their slightly less illustrious cousins, who produced the earliest surviving manuscripts from Golconda. And I believe it was they, rather than Persian emigres, so often credited with the prominence of Persianate artistic traditions in the Deccan and Mughal courts. I'm now going to turn to a Khamsa Nizami in the Andhra Pradesh State Museum, which is in Hyderabad. And perhaps my emphasis, or the point that I was just making about local artists, will become clearer. If not, I hope it's something that we can talk about at the end. It takes a little unpacking. And one other thing I wanted to say about this manuscript is that it's one that I stumbled upon in Hyderabad in 2010. It had been cataloged as Akbari Mughal. And it's not well known, it hasn't been professionally photographed, it's not published. My photos were all taken with a copying machine. And so what I present today is preliminary, and I particularly welcome comments on this part of the talk. This Khamsa is an example of what's often referred to today as a refurbished manuscript. It lacks a colophon, but based on the evidence of its calligraphy, the format of text pages like these, and the nature of the illumination, we can deduce that it was probably made in Shiraz around 1420. The opening illumination, for example, is of a type associated with the 15th century. And if you look up here, you can make out what is a Qutb seal. The manuscript was not illustrated at the time of its creation, and none of the typical empty spaces remain where pictures might have been intended to lie. For those of you who are familiar with manuscripts, you get used to sort of seeing these peculiar shaped blank spots in the middle of text pages where a painting was intended to go. We don't have any of that here. But the original producers did leave about one recto and one verso blank in between each of the poems in the Khamsa. These blank pages today support paintings. This painting, still with the manuscript but now loose, shows a royal couple feasting and enjoying dancing and music inside a palace, with gardens visible just behind. Based on codicological evidence, I believe it was made to serve as one half of a frontispiece. In its subject matter and composition, the image is very typical of the courtly scenes that grace the opening pages of many 16th century Persian manuscripts produced in Iran and Central Asia in the 16th century. When it's put side by side with images from other manuscripts that can be linked to Golconda, however, idiosyncratic motifs that appear in them all begin to stand out. I'll point to just one of these, the lunette-shaped wooden shutters that appear in all three of these manuscripts, and they have very sort of specific gold fixtures, knobs, and hinges. Based on this and other similar idiosyncratic stylistic features, I would venture a date of about 1575 for the paintings in the Khamsa. Like this one on the right, the remainder of the paintings in this Khamsa conform stylistically to mid-16th century Shirazi painting, with a touch, I would say, of late 16th century Golconda. And take, for example, the painting of Khusro encountering Shireen bathing, where we see the maiden in the lower right, her clothes hanging on a nearby tree, and Khusro watching her from horseback, from a hillside above. In the costumes and the facial types, we see the painters following norms established in Iran, while the color palette and the stringy pink and white clouds resemble images from other Golconda manuscripts. These paintings, each one surrounded by a blue and gold border on three sides, constitute the full extent of the Golconda artist's interventions into the fabric of this manuscript. There's no evidence to suggest that they altered the illuminations or the text, that they added or removed any pages, or that they changed the order of its various components. The paintings they added reflect a style that was likely current in Golconda at the time. If in adding contemporary elements to a 15th century manuscript, they introduced into it a certain visual discontinuity, there's no evidence that this was apparent at that time. And since they only painted on blank pages between sections of text, it's impossible to select an opening in which there are elements from different periods visible simultaneously. If we think then about Mughal artists for a moment, Mughal artists did many manuscript refurbishments in this period, some of them quite minimal and some much more aggressive. And Yael Rice at Amherst College has recently suggested that their work seems to indicate a variability in the reception of illustrated manuscripts at the Mughal court. And yet, despite this variability, in many cases, we find Mughal artists painting over earlier illustrations in order to bring the depiction of landscapes, faces, and space itself into line with current taste, or even to insert images of their imperial patron or his predecessors. Perhaps one could say that the Mughal painters, that the Mughal artists painted on and over earlier imagery, whereas the Golconda artists here painted around it, aiming at much more subtle effects. This difference may reflect the likely fact that this khamsa was not made for a royal patron, or in a centralized workshop in which a court style might have coalesced, and where the manuscript refurbishment could be shaped by a political agenda. We lack firm evidence about the circumstances under which this khamsa was made. But one possible scenario is that the paintings were added by an artist working alone, perhaps in service to a nobleman who hoped to win favor at the Qutb Shahi court by making this enhanced manuscript a gift. The artist needed only some training in painting and access to manuscripts from Shiraz or other parts of Iran, and possibly also to manuscripts produced in the Delhi Sultanate, where Turkmen Shirazi painting had made a significant impact. What we have in the khamsa that I've just shown you is, I would say, a modest and conservative attempt by local artists to reproduce the standard pictorial content of an illustrated khamsa Nizami. They added a flourish or two of their own, but they didn't attempt any improvement upon the other elements of the manuscript. In this next manuscript that I'll look at, the artists seem to have become much more ambitious and to have acquired full command of the techniques needed to produce the Persianate manuscript. It's a copy of a Persian text called the Sinbad Nama, or Masnavi Sinbad, now in the British Library. It contains 72 illustrations and an elaborate frontispiece. Like the khamsa, it lacks a colophon, but it appears to have been created whole cloth in the Deccan and bears the blurred remains of a Qutb Shahi seal. I just want to quickly say that this manuscript has been attributed to Golconda since the 1950s, when a group of scholars first noticed that its paintings resemble those in a manuscript in the Chester Beatty Library that has many Qutb Shahi seals within its pages. I believe that now that we know about the khamsa that I began with, the attribution of the Sinbad Nama is much more secure. They kind of all fit together like puzzle pieces. The stylistic affinities between the khamsa and this manuscript are strong enough that I believe they were painted by the same artist. And I hope that for the purposes of this lecture, you'll allow me to assure you that these connections are there. And so I'm not going to labor over a whole lot of visual comparisons between the two of them, but I'm going to move on to discussions of other aspects of the manuscript. Unlike the khamsa, the Sinbad Nama the text of the Sinbad Nama does not exist in innumerable copies. It is the only copy of a versified telling of the stories of a vizier named Sinbad, composed in 1374-5 by an unidentified author. I imagine that a 15th or 16th century illustrated copy or copies of this versified text or the prose version of the text will one day appear in a museum or on the art market. But for now, we have nothing with which to directly compare. The manuscript opens with a Solomon and Bilqis frontispiece, and it follows the conventions of Shirazi frontispieces from the first half of the 16th century. The remainder of the paintings in the manuscript are, broadly speaking, related to mid-16th century Shiraz painting. There are, however, idiosyncrasies, such as the brown doors that I mentioned before, a unique manner of depicting rocky landscapes and clouds, and also the appearance of a facial type that I have dubbed the protruding nose. It's not the most elegant phrase, but you can see this figure here. There are a lot of figures in this manuscript that are in a seen in 3/4. And usually in a Persian manuscript, you would not expect the nose of a figure seen in 3/4 to protrude beyond the profile of the face, but these figures have these bulbous noses that stick out and kind of blur the line between a profile and a 3/4 view. Two illustrations in the manuscript give us a good sense of the artist's grappling with Persianate imagery. These depict a story about a bathkeeper who invites a prince to make love to his wife while he looks on. Nora Titley pointed out that the compositions of these two paintings are based on a model established in depictions of another bathhouse story, Harun al-Rashid and the Barber, from the Khamsa Nizami. More recently, Lale Uruj has shown that in the 16th century, bathhouse scenes became very popular in Shirazi painting and began to appear in illustrated copies of many different texts. A reference to Ferdowsi having visited a bathhouse, for example, was used by artists as an excuse to add one of these scenes to manuscripts of that text, of the Shahnameh. So it shouldn't surprise us to find an image like this in the Sinbad Nama, and by and large, the familiar imagery appears without alteration. But I'll point out one interesting divergence. In the latter half of the 16th century, these scenes began to depict the rear of the main chamber of the bathhouse as divided into 3 niches, the domed roofs of which were decorated with colored dots, representing, I think, circular colored glass windows. These kind of Diwan forms in the back here, and then the little, presumably glass windows at the top there. In the upper margin of the Sinbad Nama paintings are 3 semicircles filled with colored circles, clearly owing their origins to the bathhouse domes. The vaulted niches themselves are not represented, however, and one has little sense of how they relate to the architectural space depicted below. While many scholars, I think, refer to this kind of thing as misunderstandings of Persian imagery, and that might in some sense be true, the way I'd like to frame it is to suggest that this type of change reflects the remove at which the artists were working from major centers of production of this type of manuscript and this type of imagery. And also it may reflect the absence of a supervisor trained in Iran. Other paintings in the manuscript show very skillful rendering of forms, however, and suggest that the artists were in fact developing a solid grasp of the visual vocabulary of Persianate painting. In several paintings, for example, they play adeptly with the outer margins, stacking architectural elements into towering forms and making the most of contrast between painted forms and their paper supports. In addition, there is throughout a remarkably close relationship between text and image, with certain kinds of compositions reserved for certain specific types of episodes. The visual and formal evidence of the Sinbad Nama suggests to me a more thorough engagement with and sense of mastery over Persian manuscript production than did the Khamsa that we began with. And yet it only very subtly hints at a locally inflected version of that tradition. Lest we think that this is because it hadn't fully permeated local culture, let's turn to a set of marginal notations in the South Indian language of Kannada that appear on its pages. These notes demonstrate, I believe, that by this period, Deccani individuals whose roots lay in Indic or Sanskritic knowledge traditions were actively assimilating ideas and forms from the Persianate world into a language that was locally meaningful. The 10 notes that I'm referring to are written on early illustrated pages in the Sinbad Nama, and as I said, they're in Kannada, a language that was widely used in Bijapur, a neighboring kingdom bordering on Golconda. They're written in a script that is datable to the 16th century, according to scholars of Kannada who have graciously translated them for me. And thus we have notes that were made in Golconda or nearby, and probably near to the time of the manuscript's production. So let's begin with this image of Sinbad and other viziers gathered on a rose-colored hillside. The notation on this page says, or can be translated as, the 7 pundits consult their shastras. While Arthur Dudney and other scholars have shown that 16th century dictionaries produced in India seem to show increased awareness of cultural and linguistic differences between the center of the Persian world and its fringes, there is little here to suggest a sense of cultural divide. On the contrary, the note's author seems to have readily found Indic parallels for the Persianate or Islamic elements of the painting, the viziers and their leather-bound books. A similar phenomenon appears on folio 11, where the word tapas, referring to Hindu religious austerities, is used to describe the king's prayers, despite the fact that he sits on a prayer mat, complete with the outline of a mihrab. South India has a long tradition of depictions of figures alone in the landscape except for animals, and engaged in prayerful penance. And I think it was this, perhaps, that came into the mind of the note writer. Some notations in the manuscript convey less of a sense of commensurability. On folio 13, for example, the king watches in despair as the prince, his son, performs miserably in a classroom in front of his teacher. The note reads, "The teacher Sinbad instructs the prince in the mosque." The marginal note describes the location in which the lesson is taking place, using the Kannada word mashiti, which denotes a mosque, and derives from the Arabic word masjid. By using the word mashiti rather than a Kannada word for prayer hall, and there are many, the note writer preserves a sense of the uniqueness of this building type. Just go back for a second. I think something similar is happening in this note, where the writer refers to the king as Badshah-haru, you can see right here, rather than Raja or Maharaja. Badshah is, of course, a Persian term for king, and interestingly here it's transliterated into Kannada, and then extended with the suffix aru, which, when used to refer to a single person, indicates respect. Let's look at one more note on the first folio. Several notations have been inscribed here. You can see 2 are in Persian, Masnavi Sinbad and Sinbad Nama. In the bottom right corner is the one that I find most fascinating. It's a Kannada notation that reads Surya. In Kannada and Sanskrit, the word Surya refers to the sun or to the Hindu sun god. For those of you who do yoga, you think of the sun salute or Surya Namaskar. The note is quite different. This note, Surya, is quite different, I think, than the Persian inscriptions that are clearly titles. This is not a title. So what does it mean? One possible explanation for the Surya notation is that the term was intended as a label for this kind of illumination based on its formal qualities. After all, a shamsa is usually a circular or oval medallion with lines radiating out from it, not unlike stylized representations of the sun that one finds in many societies. Here, however, the resemblance to the sun, I would say, is not great. Another explanation is that the author of the note knew that this kind of illumination was called a shamsa, and was aware that the word is related to the Arabic word for sun, shams. If indeed the note writer understood the link between the term shamsa and the sun, he would have needed familiarity with Persian illumination and its terminology, as well as with Persian and or Arabic more generally. In other words, this may have been a quite well-informed viewer. Alternatively, the note writer may have been drawing upon a local vocabulary that speakers of Indic languages in the Deccan had developed, perhaps over a long period of time, to describe Persianate artistic forms, as they also had for such concepts as vizier, prayer, mosque. In either case, a necessary precondition would be that Persianate manuscripts were widely known in the region, and that they were of significant interest to Indic language speakers. The subtlety of these engagements with Persianate manuscript production are replaced by something much bolder in the final manuscript I'll discuss tonight. Today, It's in the collection of the Salarjung Museum in Hyderabad. It is a copy of the poems written in Deccani Urdu by the Golconda Sultan Muhammad Quli Qutb Shah, who ruled from 1580 to 1611. It's the earliest known illustrated manuscript produced for the Qutb Shahi sultans of Golconda. In addition to the fact that we're looking at royal production now, as opposed to the first two manuscripts, and looking at Urdu rather than Persian, the paintings in this manuscript seem to be the work of someone other than the artist who worked on the Khamsa and Sinbad Nama. A great deal has changed, it seems, from the evidence of these manuscripts between 1580 and about 1600. A note on the text first. Muhammad Quli Qutb Shah was an important early composer of poetry in Deccani Urdu. Deccani is a form of Hindustani written in the Arabic script that emerged among the diverse inhabitants of the Deccan in the 15th century. It's significant that Muhammad Quli chose to compose in Deccani rather than in Persian like his successor. As Sumit Guha has shown, authors in the medieval Deccan were faced with an important choice, whether to write in a local vernacular like Deccani or a translocal language like Persian. And this decision profoundly affected the meaning and the audience of their work. In effect, it determined the cultural horizon to which it would belong. In fact, both the language and the subject matter of Muhammad Quli's poems suggest an author deeply embedded in Deccani regional culture. And at the same time, they do employ Persian poetic forms, such as the Masnavi. In terms of the intermingling of the Persian and Sanskrit cosmopolis, one might say that Muhammad Quli's poetry represents the emergence of a new vernacular at an early stage, drawing on but also in some ways superseding both the Persianate and the Sanskritic traditions. But what of the imagery that accompanies these poems? Do they reflect the emergence of a Deccani visual vernacular? Let's look. The manuscript begins with this double-page illumination and a double-page sarlo at the opening of the text, identifying it as the Diwan of the Solomonic Royal Highness, may God perpetuate his reign. Spread throughout the rest of the folios are, like most 16th century Persian Diwans, relatively few illustrations, just 8. And these are less depictions of anything represented in the poetry than generic scenes relating to literary or courtly themes. We have a polo game, a scene from the story of Yusuf and Zuleika, a king being entertained at his court, Solomon and the Queen of Sheba enthroned, and so on. By and large, the compositions of these images follow conventions of Persianate manuscript illustration quite closely, despite certain idiosyncrasies in color palette, the formation of landscape elements, and one very unique characteristic, the collaging of small pieces of marbled paper onto and into the illustrations that are otherwise more traditionally painted. Delving deeper into the imagery, we find some striking, dare I say, shocking to some of us, innovations. The 4th and 5th paintings that we see here are images of the quintessential royal couple, Solomon and Bilqis. Just as in the Sinbad Nama, the compositions, the iconography within each image is conventional. But whereas the Solomon-Bilqis paintings in the Sinbad Nama appear side by side at the opening of the manuscript, as one familiar with Persian manuscripts would expect, here they do not appear at the front of the manuscript, nor are the 2 pages adjacent to one another. You can see there folios 29 and 53. What's more, they don't include one recto and one verso, but rather are both versos. Recontextualized in this way, these images no longer signify the opening of a manuscript and the world of words and images it holds, but rather serve as genre scenes like any other. And as a matter of fact, I didn't put this in originally, but I must mention that actually Bilqis has been turned into a prince. Looking closely, I think she was originally a woman, but someone went back and put a crown, a proper male's crown, over her original cap. Something equally arresting is going on in the second painting that appears in the manuscript, which depicts a scene of courtly life. Although it's hard to see at first, this composition is directly drawn from Safavid sources. Virtually every element of the image has a direct analog in paintings like the one of Khusro, listening to Barbad playing the flute from the Khamsa produced from Shah Tahmasp around 1540, although I could have chosen many paintings to compare the Golconda painting with. It does require a little bit of close looking. In both paintings, you have a ruler wearing the typical Safavid turban, the Taji Haidari, sitting in a Diwan on the right, in the upper right corner of the composition. And he's looking out onto a courtyard with a fountain. The courtyard is sort of in this segment, and then very low down in the bottom here, in the bottom right, there is a tiny fountain area and even some ducks swimming around. And then on the left side of both paintings, there's a palace. I think you can see that, topped by an open balcony under an awning, under an ornamented awning. And then both buildings are linked by, well, here we have a pathway with red railings. Here it's a little bit harder to see, but if you look closely, there's a series of steps that link the two buildings. In both cases, we have a tree suggestive of a garden behind the palace, which peeks out between the two buildings and from behind them. The parallel nature of these two compositions, I would suggest, is hard to see because of the dramatic suppression of depth in the Golconda painting and its division into compartments, which, interestingly enough, are both major features of pre-Islamic Indian painting. We have time, I think, to look at one more painting from the manuscript. Its subject is rather mysterious. Mark Zabrowski referred to it as Lady Dozing in a Garden. Karl Kandalawala suggested that it might represent a European mistress of Muhammad Quli, the author of the poems. Unfortunately, the verse running across the top of the painting offers no help in pinpointing the subject matter. Deccani Urdu is notoriously difficult, but Carla Petievich was helpful with translating some of these to the best of her ability. And if you're interested, I can tell you what she came away with looking at that poem. In the lower two-thirds of the painting, we have a bejeweled lady lying on a carpet within a low garden enclosure, surrounded by attendants who appear to be sleepy, if not actually asleep. Across the top of the page runs a band of architectural forms, suggestive of a nearby palace, through which breaks a fantastic bluish-gray cloud. The red stone of the architecture and the treatment of the blanket covering the lady point to Mughal painting as a possible source of inspiration. And Mughal painting does yield closely related images. A painting from a dispersed Mughal Yusuf and Zuleika of about 1635, for example, shows Zuleika slumbering surrounded by sleepy handmaidens. Obviously, this painting comes from later, so I'm not suggesting there's a link between these two, but rather that this may have been a type that was circulating or was seen in earlier Mughal manuscripts. And in the Mughal painting, too, we have we don't have an enclosure, but the bodies of the maidens surrounding Zuleika mark out a circular space that I think is analogous to the enclosure that we have on the left. And then other aspects of this painting suggest different pictorial sources. For example, the enclosure itself appears with frequency in Persian paintings of various subjects, such as a painting of Nishaba recognizing Iskandar from the 15th century Cartier Khamsa. Nothing in Persian or Mughal painting has anything comparable to the extraordinary cloud, however, which billows forward as though a great gust of wind is about to sweep across the page. Someplace it's not here, so clear. So this is our Golconda painting. This motif, perhaps, could be rooted in a conflation of Shirazi clouds with the wind-blown red curtains often seen in Mughal paintings. In this instance, it may be an expressive device, conveying some kind of powerful emotion, though what is hard to say. Despite the fact that some of the paintings we just looked at are strict copies of Persian paintings, while others seem to reinvent or recontextualize select Persianate motifs, I believe that we can say that all of them clearly convey identification with the Persianate world. In doing so, they situate Muhammad Quli's pioneering Deccani poems within the well-established and highly respected framework of the illustrated Persian Diwan, extending the aura of quality and credibility that surrounds classical Persian literature to works in a new literary language. But what should we make of the dizzying array of pictorial transformations of Persianate imagery wrought by the artists of this manuscript? Were they attempting to create a royal Qutb Shahi painting style? Were they creating a new vernacular? I'm not convinced. At most, it seems to me that they were actively engaged in a process of alteration, adaptation, and experimentation with Persianate models. Perhaps this was spurred by royal patronage, either by the confidence it lent to artists or by the need to create something distinctive to please a powerful sponsor. Had they finally begun to, quote-unquote, catch up with the Mughal atelier? That seems too simplistic an interpretation for this coupling of a linguistically innovative text with formally experimental but fundamentally traditional Persianate imagery. We've been looking this evening at the products of a moment of artistic transition and negotiation, one that must have gone on in centers of elite culture throughout the Persian world, but is not studied as often, I would say, as the classical periods, when an art form was at its height. The case of Golconda's early manuscripts demonstrates how differently this moment could play out in different settings, with the Mughal being the most well-known example, but perhaps one that represents the exception rather than the rule. Slower and with less cohesion than in the Mughal north, Golconda's 16th and early 17th century manuscripts seem to negotiate a path into the Persian visual world via tentative forays and later through more daring experiments. They offer us vivid and eccentric reminders that no single model of cultural diffusion applies across the Persianate world, and an opportunity to ask what was the work of illustrated manuscripts at this nexus between the Persianate and Sanskritic worlds. Thank you.